Hey everyone. I've been doing a lot of reading into generative AI and the great benefits that come along with it. I've also been reading a lot about the risks associated with it. And I'm sure if you just do a quick search on the dangers of generative AI, you're going to find plenty of articles describing sort of what those risks are, why they're concerns. And there's a pretty broad array of what these concerns are, everything from sort of ethics to more technical concerns. As a matter of fact, OWASP has published this great guide about security and privacy. A lot of concerns really do deal with people's privacy and data exposure, but a good number of these concerns are around sort of attacking the model itself, injection, poisoning, things like that. Now, as we know, OpenAI, the company that makes ChatGPT, has an agreement with Microsoft to host their services in Azure. And looking at those specific services, I found some interesting documentation, and I don't see this talked about a lot, so I thought it might be helpful to shine a spotlight on this, and it may inspire some thought, because there are some use cases where I think this could be really interesting. So digging through some of this documentation, they have some data and privacy and security docs here. And if you look through here, there is a little blurb that says, no prompts or completions are stored in the model during these operations, and it's not used to train, retrain, or improve the model. What does that mean? That means that these models are stateless. You interact with these models only for the duration of the session, and the session is also within your control. So these models are interacted with by REST API or Python SDK, and so you have a lot of control over what happens. And I'll show some diagrams in a minute, but let's walk through kind of the Microsoft example first, and then we'll go through how I think this could be very helpful in specific use cases. Not all use cases, I understand. There are some use cases, though, where this statelessness could be very beneficial to how you are trying to implement this model into your product or service. And it says it again here, no prompts or completions are stored in these content classification models. So let's take a look real quick at this. And this is straight from this documentation. I just blew it up here for ease of walking through this. But now there are a couple of layers here. What are we looking at? In the Microsoft OpenAI service, this is what it looks like. This top layer here is if you are fine-tuning the model. Now, what is fine-tuning? Fine-tuning is intentionally modifying, intentionally training a model, which has a cost. They call it embedding, which has a cost associated with it. So if you have a very specific use case where the model doesn't understand the information that you are trying to work with, you might want to embellish the model with your information specifically so that it can get a better result for your specific use case. These models are trained on pretty broad data sets, so there are things it's good at and there are things it isn't. And if you're looking to do something very specific that the model doesn't happen to be have enough training on, you can train that on your own data. That's this top piece. Does not apply for kind of general use. This is a very intentional and specific training step. This middle layer here is probably what is happening for most people, right? So, okay, there's a training, then you have your model. What you would do is you would make an API call to the model, pass it some information, ask it to do something with it, get a result. Microsoft, by default, has some observability tooling built in where as part of their responsible AI use, they have a content and an abuse monitoring that happens for the prompts and completions. And if those trigger the alert, then an actual human review from a Microsoft person will happen. They'll come and sort of take a look at that. That can be opted out, which we'll look at here. You can opt out from that if you're using that in your business service. So this is also from the Microsoft documentation. I didn't make this up. This is their doc here. If you opt out of the observability piece for content and abuse, then this communication is disabled. Prompts and completions do not get stored for 30 days with Microsoft. And they do not have visibility. Now, if you were working with a data set that's sensitive, maybe financial or health information, this is very important for your business here. So now, if this whole piece is out of scope, right? The training piece is probably not going to be used in the majority of cases. It's a very specific data set that you'd be training for. And then if you opt out of the Microsoft observability piece for content and abuse, then what you're left with is a very closed loop of prompt and completion, which is you make your API call, it acts on the API call for the duration of that session. It's going to remember the information, of course, for as long as you instruct the session to hold on to that information. Clearly, every time you're making one of these requests, you don't want the thing to have complete amnesia, right? You do want it to have some memory relevant to your use case. If your use case is a bit longer, if it's like a chat bot or something, and you want it to have a bit lengthier of a memory so that it understands some previous information about your conversation, you would be holding that in the session. But as soon as you close the session, it's like you never met this model, right? You both go your separate ways, it forgets about you, and the next time you make this new API call, it hasn't learned anything from your previous conversations, it hasn't retained any of your information, it's completely stateless. And that is huge in specific use cases. You might ask, well, then why is this even useful at all? Let's take a look at how I'm thinking about using this in kind of a real world model. You have a user that authenticates to your web application, your app tier. This is your sort of Azure boundary here. And you process their request through API. And this is where you have a lot of layers of control, right? Obviously, you're going to have an authenticated user. That's why I bothered putting a little key here. And that's already one boundary of control. Then you have this API management layer here where you're going to do things like restrict the rate limiting so that someone can't come in here and abuse this and run up a bunch of charges. You also have full control over the granularity of information that's coming in and out of these requests. You can really shape the information that's going back and forth. So there's another layer of control here. You also have options with which model you use. DaVinci right now is the most sophisticated. You can get on the waiting list right now to use GPT-4, but these are GPT-3, or I think they have 3.5 or 3.5 Turbo. There's some models you can pick from, but there's sort of 4 base models that go from very basic. Ada is the most basic one. Babbage is the next one. Curie is the next most complex, and DaVinci right now is the most complex model that they offer. And those all have, of course, increasing costs and different token minimums and maximums, and you can dig that out of the documentation. But for the purpose of this, I think it's worth explaining, or at least demonstrating, that you wouldn't just use one model for all requests, because it might be too much, might be more than what you need depending on what you're doing. So you might have an API call that goes to Ada, you might have a different API call and use case that you need a little more power and you'd go to Babbage. You might have a very complex, more complex or conversational use case where you would want to go to DaVinci or eventually GPT-4, whatever they call that. And those all have different costs and different max tokens and things that you can use. But suffices to say, the user would come in here and you've got some layers of control. And then you have these models which are inherently, by default, stateless. It's up to you, actually, to then either push some of the prompts and completions out to maybe encrypted storage, push these to your log and audit trail, maybe push them to your data lake. It's up to you where you want this data to go, and that's up to your own application, how it's going to handle the information. If you're using the public version of ChatGPT, there is some learning that happens in the model, right? And they're very upfront about that, and that's you know that comes with the territory of using those some more publicly available models. But if you're hosting this yourself in Microsoft Azure OpenAI services, these models by default do not learn from your prompt. What you're left with is a intelligent text processor that does not have any kind of memory associated with it. And I think that's really important. So in the use case where if someone's coming in and interacting in sort of a temporary way, I think a chatbot is probably a good use case. Hi, I have a question. You can go grab information about the person related to how you've designed your API, right? You can go pull some information in to the session and now process it and return it to the user. And then when this user session is over, all of that data doesn't stay in the model. You've brought some information in about the person, processed it, returned it, done whatever you need to do with it, provided it back to the user by way of conversation, and then it's gone. That is a very different mindset in how to use these machine learning models, because I think the pervasive thought around this is anything I put into these models, it's going to absorb, it's going to learn, it's going to train, it's going to retain. And that in this Azure OpenAI service use case is not true. By default, these don't learn, retain, train on anything. It's double-sided, right? For example, if what you want is the machine to learn and understand, you're going to need to use other layers. You can't rely on simply just spinning up this large language model here, because it's not going to remember anything. You're going to need to layer on some other Azure services to help you do that. If you have use cases that fit this statelessness, I think this is very critical information for people to have. It kind of flips these large language models on their head. Instead of absorbing and retaining and learning everything, it actually retains and learns nothing. From a security standpoint, if someone's coming here and trying to poison or inject in bad information, it's going to be up to how you're handling that information, right? If you're writing that to longer term storage, more durable storage, or other services, then then someone can potentially poison your data set. But by default, that's not happening. That's up to how you're going to handle that information. So this is why how you construct, and I have a blog post actually on API security, how you construct your requests is going to be really, really critical to the success of your application. And what you do with this information, how you handle this information, is really up to you. Hope that generated some thought for you, and thanks for watching.